His hands were not what anyone expected of an emperor. There were calluses where the stylus rested, and beneath the calluses, the particular hardness that comes not from court life, but from years spent outdoors in all weather, riding and camping and reviewing legions in the wind off the Danube. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, ruler of the largest administrative arrangement the Western world had yet produced, was sitting at a field table in the military encampment at Sirmium, writing in Greek in a notebook he had never shown to anyone and never intended to show to anyone, by the light of a lamp that was beginning to gutter in a draught from the tent's entrance. The hour was late. The camp had settled into its nocturnal sounds, the distant call of a sentry, the movement of horses, the low murmur of men who had been awake too long. And Marcus wrote. He wrote not for posterity. He wrote not to construct a philosophical system that later generations would study in translation. He wrote the way a person writes when they are trying to hold themselves to something, when the distance between who they know they should be and who they found themselves being today requires an accounting that only words can provide. The notebook was a private thing, a discipline, something closer to what a serious person of our own time might keep on the bedside table, not a diary exactly, and not a journal exactly, but a set of reminders addressed to the self, in the second person, in the tone of a patient teacher who has delivered the same lesson before and is prepared, without impatience, to deliver it again. He called the work Nothing, the title by which the world came to know these pages. The asterisk Meditations asterisk was given much later by others after Marcus was gone and the notebook had found its way, by some rote no scholar has fully traced, into the hands of people who recognized in it something worth keeping. Marcus himself, in those late military evenings, had no such assessment of what he was doing. He was working, he was practicing, and the practice, as he understood it, was never finished. Sirmium was not a comfortable posting. It sits in what is now Serbia, on the river Sava, well north of anything Marcus's predecessors had considered the natural center of the civilized world. The frontier wars that occupied the last decade of his reign brought him repeatedly to this region, to Sirmium and to Carnuntum and to Aquincum, to camps that were organized and disciplined, but unmistakably military, unmistakably far from the libraries and gardens and cultivated conversation of Rome. The men around him were soldiers, capable and loyal, but not the philosophers and rhetoricians and Stoic teachers among whom he had spent the most formative years of his intellectual life. In the camps, he was largely alone with his thinking, and his thinking, those long evenings, returned again and again to the notebook. What he wrote there, when it was finally read by the world, struck many readers as unexpected, not because the ideas were obscure. The Stoic tradition from which he drew was well established, several centuries old, and had been practiced and taught and refined by men far more systematically trained than Marcus. What surprised people was the tone. Here was the most powerful man alive, and the words he addressed to himself in private were not the words of power. They were the words of a person who woke up most mornings already aware of his own shortcomings, who was susceptible to flattery in ways he found embarrassing, who found it genuinely difficult to rise early despite knowing he should, who caught himself more often than he would have liked, performing a virtue rather than embodying it. The asterisk Meditations asterisk contain not a single moment of self-congratulation. They contain instead a great deal of patient self-correction, the philosophical equivalent of returning to the beginning of a piece of music after losing the thread and beginning again, without drama, from the first note. This is the Marcus Aurelius worth knowing, not the statue on the Capitoline Hill, bronze and impassive and larger than life, but the man at the field table with the guttering lamp, writing to remind himself that the philosophy he had spent his life studying was not a possession but a practice, and that a practice was something one returned to daily, and that the returning was the point. The world in which Marcus grew up had clear ideas about what an educated Roman of his class should be doing with philosophy. The Antonine dynasty, the succession of emperors from Nerva through Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and eventually Marcus himself, treated Greek philosophy not as an academic specialty, but as a practical instrument for governance and for the conduct of private life. Philosophy, in this milieu, was what you did with serious intellectual training, the way a soldier does something with physical training. You used it every day to become more capable of managing what came at you. The great teachers of the period were not purely theoretical figures. They were men whose lives were taken as demonstrations of their doctrines. Marcus encountered this world young. He was born in 121 CE and came to the attention of the Emperor Hadrian early, one of several children who were noticed, assessed, and positioned as future rulers in the careful, somewhat unsentimental manner of Roman dynastic politics. What distinguished Marcus among them was not ambition. Those who knew him seem to have agreed that he lacked the ordinary appetite for power, but seriousness. He was a serious boy. He studied with the seriousness that some people apply to all of living, not only to particular subjects, and this quality attracted teachers who were serious in return. Among his teachers was the Platonist Apollonius of Chalcedon, who taught Marcus something of the method of careful argument that Plato had developed, and that the centuries since Plato had refined and contested and refined again. Marcus records his debt to Apollonius in the first book of the Meditations, in a list of what he learned from each of the people who shaped him, a list remarkable for its specificity and its absence of any trace of flattery. From Apollonius, he says he learned consistency, to remain always the same amid physical suffering and mental effort alike, and to see that rational discipline, when genuinely applied, was not a form of harshness, but a kind of freedom. There was also Fronto, the greatest Latin rhetorician of the age, who taught Marcus the art of public speech and public argument, the performance of reason before an audience. Marcus was skilled at this. He was trained in it thoroughly by one of the finest teachers available. The letters between Marcus and Fronto have survived and show a warm, intellectually stimulating relationship between student and master. And yet Marcus, when he came to write in the notebook that nobody else would read, placed rhetoric considerably lower in the hierarchy of what mattered than Fronto would have wished. The Meditations are written in Greek, not Latin, and in a style that has nothing to do with public persuasion. They are the private notes of a man who had learned to perform well in public, and had come to believe that performance, however accomplished, was not the thing. The turn away from rhetoric and toward the deeper philosophical practice came through a man named Quintus Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher and later a senior figure in the Roman administration, who gave Marcus something that changed the character of his intellectual life. Rusticus introduced him to the lecture notes of Epictetus. These were not Epictetus's own writings. Epictetus wrote nothing himself, but notes taken down by a student named Arrian, who had attended Epictetus's school in Nicopolis and tried to preserve on paper what could be heard in the classroom. The text that resulted, known now as the Discourses and its shorter summary, the Enchiridion carried something of the quality of Epictetus's actual speaking, direct, unsparing, almost startlingly honest about the difficulty of living according to the principles it described. Marcus records his gratitude to Rusticus for introducing him to this text with a specificity that suggests the encounter was felt as decisive. There is something in the image of a young Marcus receiving this worn second-hand copy, holding it the way one holds something that is about to ask a great deal, that seems to contain the hinge of his philosophical life. Before Epictetus, Marcus had been well educated in several philosophical traditions and had shown every sign of the intelligent, curious, broadly cultivated mind that his upbringing was designed to produce. After Epictetus, something settled into a different arrangement. The Stoic discipline became the central practice, rather than one subject among others. What Epictetus gave him was not, primarily, an argument to be convinced by. It was a method, or rather a distinction, the most important distinction in Stoic practice, the one from which almost everything else followed. There are things that are up to us, and there are things that are not up to us. The things that are up to us are, essentially, our judgments, our values, our choices about how to respond to what comes at us. The things that are not up to us are everything else, our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, the behavior of other people, the weather of the world. Stoic practice begins with learning to tell the difference, and it does not end. The distinction sounds simple. It is not simple. Most of what produces suffering in an ordinary human life comes from treating things in the second category as though they belong in the first. Marcus wrote this out many times, in many formulations. He was reminding himself. He had understood the distinction for years. Understanding it was not the difficulty. The difficulty was living it out in the actual texture of days that contained meddlesome advisors, military setbacks, physical illness, ungrateful subordinates, and the constant pressure of being looked at by a world that expected the most powerful man alive to be something particular. The asterisk meditations asterisk are, among other things, a document of what it costs to hold an intellectual commitment in the face of everything that daily life provides to dissolve it. Plato had written in the asterisk Republic asterisk that cities would find no peace until philosophers became kings, or kings became philosophers. The remark had floated through 4 centuries of political thought by the time Marcus read it, admired by many, and put into practice by almost no one, because the conditions it required were exactly the conditions that political life tended to destroy. Power needs compliance. Philosophy requires honesty. Power rewards the cultivation of appearance. Philosophy demands the examination of what lies beneath appearance. The philosopher king was a figure whom Plato clearly thought was possible, but whom history had been reluctant to produce. Marcus was the closest thing history would come to it, and the account he left in the asterisk, Meditations asterisk, suggests that Plato's optimism about the possibility of combining these roles was not entirely misplaced, but that the combination was far harder than the phrase implied. The philosophical life, as Marcus had understood it since his youth, required leisure for reflection, the company of serious thinkers, freedom from administrative urgency, the ability to attend to one's interior life without constant interruption from the claims of the exterior one. The emperor's life contained almost none of these conditions. Marcus spent the years most philosophers would devote to deepening their practice, managing legal disputes, overseeing building projects, conducting negotiations with client kingdoms, and in the last decade of his reign, commanding Roman armies in the field against enemies who were pressing hard against a frontier that had been stable for generations. He did not choose this. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him before anything else is said about his philosophy. He did not choose the reign. He did not pursue it, or scheme for it, or position himself toward it. in the way that men who want power position themselves. The Emperor Antoninus Pius, who was his adoptive father, and who ruled for 23 years with a steadiness that Marcus clearly admired and tried to emulate, arranged the succession in a way that gave Marcus no real choice. The throne was not offered, it was placed in front of him by a man he loved, and who was dying, and who had decided that Marcus was what Rome needed. To decline would have been a kind of philosophical failure, a retreat from obligation, dressed up as a preference for the examined life. Marcus accepted. He took on a co-emperor at first, sharing the formal rule with Lucius Verus, a man of rather different temperament and rather different habits, who was Marcus's adoptive brother, and who proved, whatever his other qualities, a capable enough military commander. The arrangement was unprecedented. Rome had not had co-emperors in this sense, and it required Marcus to govern publicly in a structure that divided administrative authority, while leaving the philosophical labor, as it always does, entirely to the individual who undertakes it. No one could philosophize on Marcus's behalf. The public role could be shared. The interior practice was his alone. This is the distinction the Stoics cared about most, between the role and the person who fills it, between the performance that public life requires and the interior cultivation that public life tends to make more difficult. Roman culture understood the role clearly. The emperor was expected to look a certain way, speak a certain way, conduct public ceremonies with appropriate gravity, receive delegations, pronounce judgments, appear at games. Marcus did all of this. He was, by the accounts of his contemporaries, a conscientious emperor, attentive to legal detail, genuinely concerned with the welfare of people whose names he would never know. But there was, beneath the performance, something that the Stoics would have recognized, and for which they had a specific vocabulary: the asterisk hegemonok. On asterisk, the ruling faculty, is the Stoic term for the seat of consciousness, the place in which judgments are formed and values held, and the quality of a life actually determined. The performance of external role is, in Stoic terms, essentially neutral, not bad, not particularly good, but also not the place where anything philosophically significant is decided. What matters is what the ruling faculty is doing while the role is being performed. A person can stand before an official ceremony in the Roman Forum and simultaneously maintain an interior philosophical practice, can observe the ceremony from a slight remove, watching the emperor perform as the philosopher watches from behind, the performance neither absent nor merged, present and aware, and held in the discipline. Marcus did this, the asterisk meditations asterisk read, in part as evidence that he did this constantly. He notes in Book 2 that he has prepared himself each morning by saying to himself, "Today he will meet with meddling men, ungrateful men, violent men, treacherous men, envious and uncharitable men." He says this to himself, not because he has been defeated by the world or frightened of it, but as preparation, the way a person checks the weather before setting out, not to change it, but to know how to dress. The philosophical morning practice of Marcus Aurelius was a kind of anticipatory honesty about the texture of the day, followed by the Stoic reminder that the behavior of other people is not up to him, has never been up to him, and cannot touch what actually matters unless he allows it to. He was, by his own account, not always successful in maintaining this. The asterisk meditations asterisk contain enough self-criticism to make clear that he failed regularly, fell short of his own standard, gave in to impatience or irritation or vanity more often than the philosophy approved. This is not a secondary detail. This is, in a sense, the whole point. The practice Marcus was engaged in was not a record of philosophical achievement. It was not a celebration of how far he had come. It was day after day in military camps and imperial residences, and wherever else the duties of rule took him, the simple continued activity of a person who had decided to try to live according to a philosophical discipline, and who had found, as everyone who makes such a decision finds, that the trying is ongoing and the standard remains where it was, regardless of the distance traveled toward it. There is a word for this in the Stoic tradition, ascesis, practice, training, the kind of disciplined exercise that is the opposite of the single decisive achievement. You do not achieve Stoic virtue the way you complete a military campaign. You practice it the way you practice an instrument, daily, with attention to the gap between where you are and where the music requires, without shame about the gap and without complacency about the progress. Marcus's teachers had given him this, Rusticus most directly, through Epictetus, whose own life was itself a demonstration of the doctrine's core claim. Epictetus had been a slave, not metaphorically, but in the literal legal sense of a person owned by another person. He had lived under conditions that Roman law defined as the maximum of external constraint, in which one's body, one's time, one's movement, and labor were all formally the property of someone else. And he had arrived through the Stoic distinction between what is up to us and what is not, at a freedom so complete that his contemporaries found it almost incomprehensible. The self that mattered, the ruling faculty, the interior life, the capacity to form judgments and hold values, was not a slave, could not be made a slave. No external condition could reach it, as long as the person who possessed it understood what it was and what it was not. Marcus had not been a slave. His life had contained no such external constraint. But the Stoic insight transferred perfectly to his situation, because what was constraining him was precisely the external, the role, the obligation, the eyes of the world, the demands of administration and military command and dynastic responsibility. None of this touched the ruling faculty. The ruling faculty, Epictetus had written, is always free. Marcus read this and returned to it, many times in many formulations, because it was the hinge on which his ability to remain a philosopher while being an emperor depended. The cultural world in which Marcus moved had given him the vocabulary for this. The Antonine court was not a court that had to apologize for taking philosophy seriously. The tradition of Greek philosophical education as a qualification for Roman governance went back centuries, and by Marcus's time it was thoroughly woven into the expectation of what a cultivated person of the ruling class would know, and how they would conduct themselves. Apollonius of Chalcedon, the Platonist who taught Marcus in his youth, was a man of genuine philosophical distinction, not an ornamental teacher kept for the appearance of refinement. The intellectual life Marcus was trained for was taken seriously because the people who trained him took it seriously. And yet the depth of that seriousness in Marcus's case seems to have exceeded what the culture required of him. It was not enough to be able to discuss Stoic doctrines at dinner or to cite Epictetus when the occasion called for it. What the notebook required, what the philosophy required, was something more demanding, the daily, private, unwitnessed work of trying to actually live according to what one had understood to be true. This is why the asterisk meditations feel different from a philosophical treatise. They do not argue for Stoicism, they assume it, and then they work within it, the way a musician assumes the key they are playing in, and then finds the phrase. Book 2 begins with those morning preparations. Book 6 will instruct the reader, which is to say, Marcus himself, to survey the circling stars as though moving with them. Book 7 will observe the festivals and voyages and wars of humankind from above, from a vantage that reveals them in their proper scale. These are not ornamental passages, they are exercises. They are instructions that Marcus wrote down because he needed to be able to return to them, to find the exercise again, to perform it again, the way one returns to the same physical exercise, because the body requires it to maintain a particular capacity. The view from above, the deliberate imaginative act of lifting one's perspective out of the immediate and into the cosmic, was a practice he came back to reliably, because he had found it reliable, because it worked. That word works is important in a way that distinguishes the Stoics from many of the philosophical traditions Marcus was also familiar with. The Stoics cared very much about what worked, not in the shallow sense of what produced comfort or what made one feel better in the short term, but in the sense of what actually aligned the interior life with truth, what actually produced the equanimity they were claiming was available. The philosophy was tested against life. If an idea failed in the field, it was not a good idea, regardless of how elegant the argument for it was. Marcus spent his life in the field. The asterisk meditations asterisk are, among their other qualities, a field test of Stoic doctrine, the record of which exercises held up under the actual conditions of a life containing war, grief, administrative exhaustion, physical illness, and the knowledge that one was being watched constantly. He does not record the results of this field test in the form of a conclusion. There is no final entry in the asterisk meditations asterisk in which Marcus declares himself satisfied with his progress. No moment of philosophical arrival. The last surviving entries read the same as the first ones, patient, self-critical, returning to the same themes and the same exercises, and the same quietly honest recognition that the work continues. He was, by all historical accounts, a man who took his mortality seriously and faced it without dramatic distress, which suggests that the Stoic practice had given him something real. But he did not claim in the notebook to have completed the journey. He claimed only to be continuing it. This is what makes his example different from what an example of the same ideas might be in the hands of someone who had lived an easier life or made it to the end of their days without having been tested on this scale. Marcus was tested enormously. The frontier wars of his reign, the plague that moved through the empire killing tens of thousands, the administrative weight of governing a structure that required constant attention and showed no signs of simplifying. All of this was the material against which his philosophy was pressed. The notebook records the pressing. It does not record a man whose philosophy protected him from difficulty. It records a man whose philosophy gave him a way to remain oriented within difficulty, a way to continue practicing when everything around him was conspiring to make practice difficult. It is worth staying with this for a moment, not the difficulties themselves, which were considerable, but the quality of his response to them. Marcus does not write like a man in crisis. He writes like a man who is working. There is a steadiness to the voice in the asterisk, meditations, asterisk, that is not the steadiness of someone who has been numbed to difficulty or who has retreated from engagement. It is the steadiness of someone who has practiced for long enough, the act of receiving what comes without being defined by it, who has internalized through repetition and return and daily exercise the Stoic understanding that what happens is not the same thing as what the ruling faculty does with what happens, and that the second is what matters, and that the second is always within reach. He failed at this by his own account. He was impatient when he had resolved to be patient. He was susceptible to flattery when he had resolved to see through it. He woke late when he had resolved to wake early. The asterisk meditations. Asterisk are honest about this in a way that is bracing. There is no self-serving reinterpretation of failure as something other than failure. No philosophical argument for why his shortcomings were not really shortcomings. They were. He knew they were. And the next morning he began again. Plato's philosopher king is a figure of ideal completeness, someone who has arrived at wisdom and who governs from that arrived place. Marcus is something different and in certain ways more instructive. He is the philosopher who has not arrived. He is the philosopher who is still, every morning, in the middle of the work, still covering the same ground, still writing the same reminders, still measuring the distance between who the philosophy asks him to be and who he found himself being today. The gap does not close, but the direction does not change, and in the Stoic understanding of what philosophical practice actually is, it is the direction that matters, not the distance already traveled. Somewhere on the Danube frontier, in a tent that has long since returned to dust, by the light of a lamp that burned for an hour and then went out, he wrote all of this down, not for posterity, not for the empire, for himself, as an act of philosophical discipline addressed to himself in the second person, in the patient and slightly severe voice of a teacher who has delivered the same lesson before and is prepared to deliver it again. The night sounds of the Roman camp moved around him, the sentry, the horses, the river, the dark, and when he had done what the night required, he set down the stylus and closed the notebook, and the practice was complete, for now until morning came, and the practice began again. He was not where he wanted to be. He had never claimed to be. What he had claimed, what the philosophy had given him the courage to claim, was something more modest and more durable, that he knew which direction to face, that the standard was clear, that falling short of it today was not the same as abandoning it, that the practice returned to daily with honesty and without drama was itself the point, not a route to a destination already reached, but a direction faithfully kept through the long, ordinary, demanding, unspectacular work of trying to live well in a world that had not arranged itself to make this easy, and that never would. Zeno of Citium arrived in Athens, carrying nothing. The ship that had brought him from his home port, loaded with Phoenician purple dye, cargo he had spent years accumulating, was somewhere at the bottom of the sea. He was not a young man, and he had lost everything that by any ordinary measure a merchant was supposed to spend his life protecting. He walked into the city on foot, and at some point, perhaps because he had nowhere particular to be and no inventory to worry about, he walked into a bookshop and asked the owner what he was reading. The owner showed him a text about Socrates. Zeno sat down and read it. And what happened next? Whatever private reorganization occurred in a man who had just lost his livelihood and found himself, for the first time in perhaps years, entirely free of its demands, set in motion a tradition that would reach, 5 centuries later, into a Roman emperor's tent on the banks of the Danube. That is not a simple chain of cause and effect. Nothing in philosophy moves that cleanly. But it is worth staying for a moment with the image of Zeno in the bookshop, a man with no cargo, no plans, no reason to be anywhere, reading about another man who had also possessed very little, and had also, by most external measures, ended badly. Socrates had been executed. His property, such as it was, had been modest. His life had not, by conventional reckoning, gone well, and yet the account of it that Zeno held in his hands was not a tragedy, it was something else. It was the record of a person who had located his freedom somewhere that circumstance could not reach, and who had, in consequence, remained himself to the end. Zeno set down the text and asked the bookseller where he could find men like Socrates. The bookseller pointed, as the story has it, at a philosopher named Crates passing in the street. Zeno followed him. The school of thought that would eventually be called Stoicism had not yet begun. What had begun was the education of a man who had just discovered that what the sea had taken from him was, in some fundamental sense, not what he was. He would spend years in Athens, studying with Crates and with others, working through the philosophical inheritance that had accumulated in the century and a half since Socrates had died. He was drawn to the questions that bore most directly on how a person ought to live, not as theory, not as elegant disputation, but as the actual daily practice of being a rational creature in a world that resisted rational arrangement. Around 300 BCE, he began teaching in a public space in Athens, a covered walkway called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, named for the frescoes decorating its walls. Those frescoes depicted famous battles, the Greeks at Marathon, the fall of Troy, scenes of violence and upheaval, and the overturning of everything. Beneath them, Zeno stood and spoke about equanimity. The people who gathered to listen came to be called Stoics, students of the porch, and in time the teaching they received would be formalized into a philosophy of unusual comprehensiveness and internal consistency. At its center was a claim about the nature of reality itself, and this claim was not an afterthought or a preamble to the practical advice. It was the foundation on which everything else was built. The Stoics held that the cosmos was not a random collision of matter. It was not governed by indifferent or capricious gods. Running through all of it, through every stone, every tree, every animal, every human mind, was something they called the asterisk logos. Asterisk, an active, rational organizing principle that was simultaneously the structure of the universe and the source of the capacity for reason in human beings. The word asterisk logos, asterisk, resists clean translation. It carries meaning that falls somewhere among reason, word, principle, and intelligence. The Stoics sometimes identified it with Zeus, not the anthropomorphic Zeus of popular religion, but the rational fire that they held to be the deepest reality of which the cosmos was composed. Clinces, who succeeded Zeno and spent decades developing and teaching the philosophy before passing the school to Chrysippus, addressed this principle directly in the asterisk hymn to Zeus. Asterisk, not as a prayer in any conventional sense, but as a philosophical act of acknowledgement, a mind recognizing the larger mind in which it participates. He wrote of Zeus as the power that guides the common reason through all things, the rational fire that pervades the cosmos. It is a hymn of unusual quietness for its subject matter, as if the enormity of what it is describing has produced, in the writer, not excitement, but stillness. That stillness had a specific philosophical source. If the asterisk logos, asterisk pervades all things, if the rational principle runs through the cosmos, the way blood runs through a body, then the human capacity for reason is not a lucky accident or a convenient tool. It is the place where the cosmic intelligence touches the individual life. To reason carefully and honestly is not merely a cognitive exercise, it is participation in the fundamental principle of reality. And this participation, this alignment of the individual mind with the structure of the whole, is what the Stoics meant when they spoke of living asterisk kataphasion, asterisk according to nature. The phrase is often misread as an invitation to simplicity or primitivism, a life lived close to the earth in imitation of animals. The Stoics meant something almost opposite. To live according to nature, for a human being, meant to live according to reason, because reason is the defining characteristic of the human animal, and reason is the defining characteristic of the cosmos, and to cultivate one is to come into alignment with the other. This identification of the good life with the rational life might sound abstract, removed from the texture of actual experience. It did not feel that way to the Stoics. It was, for them, the answer to a question that every person encounters, in one form or another, at some point in the night. The question of what exactly to hold on to. What is genuinely mine? What no one can take? Zeno had lost his cargo and walked into a bookshop, and the answer that he eventually arrived at, through years of study and teaching and the gradual refinement of a whole philosophical system, was that the only thing genuinely his was his capacity to reason clearly and to assent or withhold assent to whatever life presented. Everything else, the ship, the die, the health of his body, the esteem of his peers, the outcome of his plans, was, in Stoic language, adiaphora, indifferent, in the technical sense that it was not the site of virtue, and therefore not the site of genuine well-being. The word adiaphora, is easy to misread as coldness or indifference of a more ordinary kind. The Stoics were not recommending that a person care nothing about the world. They were making a more precise claim that the things which cannot be controlled are not the place where a person's genuine flourishing resides. A person can reasonably prefer health to illness, wealth to poverty, the survival of those they love. These preferences are natural and appropriate, but the Stoics called them preferred indifference genuinely worth preferring, while not, in themselves, the source of the only good that cannot be taken, the good of a mind reasoning well and choosing rightly. Chrysippus, who came to lead the school after Clynthes, and who is credited with having given Stoic philosophy its fullest and most internally consistent articulation, organized this inheritance into a tripartite structure. Philosophy for the Stoics was not divided into separate domains that one could pursue independently. Logic, physics, and ethics were three aspects of a single inquiry, each grounding the others. Logic provided the tools for clear thinking. Physics described the nature of the cosmos, the logos, the rational fire, the deterministic unfolding of events, according to an order that human beings could align themselves with or resist, but could not alter. And ethics followed from both. The right way to live was the way of reason, because reason is what the cosmos is, and because the only genuine goods are the ones that flow from reason's exercise. One could not, in this system, study ethics without studying physics, because the question of how to live is inseparable from the question of what kind of cosmos one is living in. There is something steady-making in this structure, not because it resolves all questions. Chrysippus himself argued with enormous care and left a great deal open, but because the questions it raises are questions about a world that is, at bottom, ordered rather than chaotic. The logos. Is not comforting in the way that a promise of personal reward is comforting. It is comforting in the older and quieter sense of the word. It gives the mind something to rest against, a structure that is larger than any individual fear and indifferent to any individual drama. The Roman camp is already in the picture, though Chrysippus lived and wrote in Athens 3 centuries before a Roman emperor would inherit and practice what he had built. The man in the tent writing by lamplight, he would need exactly this, a ground that did not shift, a principle that did not fluctuate with the news from the frontier. Between Chrysippus and Marcus Aurelius, the tradition moved. It moved through the later Greek schools, through the absorption of Greek philosophy into Roman intellectual life, through the writings of Cicero, who translated Stoic ideas into Latin and set them before a Roman readership for whom philosophy was a practical concern rather than a specialization. It moved through Seneca, lawyer, playwright, statesman, and reluctant advisor to Nero, who wrote letters and essays that gave Stoic practice a peculiarly domestic intimacy, as if the philosophy had come indoors and was now being discussed at a table rather than in a portico. And it moved with considerable force through Epictetus. Epictetus was born into slavery, probably in Hierapolis in Phrygia, sometime around 50 CE. He belonged to a freedman of Nero named Epaphroditus, a man of some official standing, and it is possible the historical record is thin here, and much of what survives about Epictetus's life is uncertain. That his master allowed him to attend the lectures of the Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus. What is not uncertain is what Epictetus became, a teacher of unusual authority, whose students came from great distances to hear him, and whose teaching had a quality that those students found difficult to describe without reaching for words that carried more weight than they usually carried. Calm, they said, but not the calm of someone who had never been tested, the calm of someone who had found the part of himself that testing could not reach and who had chosen, thereafter, to live there. The story that his leg was broken by his master, held in a position of torment and twisted until it snapped, while Epictetus remained still and said only quietly that the bone would break, may be legend. It may be embellished. What it describes, whether or not it is literally true, is something that Epictetus's philosophy requires to be possible: the existence of a freedom that no external circumstance, however brutal, can entirely remove. He did not arrive at this possibility as an abstract philosophical proposition. He arrived at it as a person who had lived inside conditions that would test it every day. The philosophy was not for him a comfort applied from the outside. It was what he had actually found in the space where theory and experience meet and either hold together or come apart. When Epictetus had gained his freedom and had begun to teach, he settled in Nicopolis on the northwestern coast of Greece, and his students took notes. One of them, Arian of Nicomedia, compiled these notes into two works: the Asterisk Discourses, Asterisk 4 books of lectures and dialogues, and the Asterisk Wuldkemer and Cyrodian Asterisk. The manual, the handbook, which is a compressed collection of the most practically applicable Stoic principles. It opens with a sentence that has not, in the nearly 2,000 years since it was written, lost its precision or its force. Some things are in our control, Epictetus wrote, others are not. The Greek phrase for the first category is asterisk F Haman, up to us, within our power. The phrase for the second is asterisk uk F Haman Schmidt, not up to us, not within our power. In our power, our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, the judgments we make about what we encounter. Not in our power, the body's condition, our reputation, the offices we hold or fail to hold, the outcomes of everything we attempt in the external world. This distinction is not a counsel of withdrawal. It is a map. It draws a boundary. Here is where your freedom lives, and here is where you will exhaust yourself chasing what cannot be secured. And it draws it with a precision that no amount of wishing or effort can make imprecise. The distinction, held carefully, changes the texture of experience. A person who has genuinely internalized it does not merely know that some things are outside their control. They feel it. The grip loosens, not out of apathy, but out of accuracy. The thing that seemed to require holding is seen clearly as something that was never genuinely available to be held, and the energy that was going into the holding, the endless monitoring of outcomes, the attempts to manage what cannot be managed, the anxiety that comes from staking one's well being on what may at any moment change, becomes available for something else, for the work that is actually within one's power, for the quality of attention one brings to this moment, this choice, this sentence in the notebook. This is the idea that Marcus Aurelius inherited, not in a dry doctrinal form, not as a position he was assigned to defend. He encountered it in the notes Ariane had taken of Epictetus's lectures, notes that had been passed to him by his teacher Quintus Junius Rusticus, and he encountered it as something he recognized, a man who had been made emperor against his preference, who spent years conducting military campaigns he found brutal and exhausting, who wrote privately in Greek in notebooks he never intended for publication, had found in Epictetus's formulation something that matched the contour of his actual experience. He had found a philosophy equal to the conditions of his life. What Epictetus had given him was not comfort in the easy sense. It was something more durable. It was a way of standing inside difficulty that did not require the difficulty to resolve. Marcus would lose campaigns and gain them. The plague would move through the empire. The frontier would hold, and then give way, and then hold again. His administrative burdens would not lighten. The people he governed would be, as he noted in his meditations, meddling and ungrateful and treacherous in the ordinary human proportions. None of this was within his control. Oh, what was within his control? The quality of his judgment, the honesty of his self-examination, the care with which he returned each morning to the philosophical practice that he could tend to. And the tending was enough, not because it solved everything, but because it was the right thing to tend. There is a line of philosophical descent running from the Athens of the painted porch to the tent on the Danube, and it is worth tracing, not because it moves inevitably toward any particular destination, but because what travels along it is not simply information. Ideas travel, of course. Arguments travel. The specific formulations that Zeno arrived at, that Chrysippus elaborated, that Epictetus demonstrated and taught, all of these move from one mind to the next, changed in the moving, adapted to new circumstances, and yet recognizably continuous with their origins. But something else travels too, something that does not have a single technical name, though the Stoics gestured at it in various ways: the lived practice of philosophy, the understanding that a philosophical position is not genuinely held until it is felt in the body, enacted in behavior, returned to daily with the same care and the same honesty that one would bring to any demanding craft. Zeno had found this in the wreckage of his commercial life, in the silence that followed the loss of everything he had been organized around, in the bookshop where a text about Socrates had reached him at the moment he was most open to being reached. Epictetus had found it in conditions of servitude, in the daily experience of having one's body owned by another person, while discovering, not merely arguing, but discovering that one's rational soul was not in the same ownership. Marcus found it in a life of public obligation that left him almost no private space in which to be simply himself, and in that cramped private space he found, with the help of the tradition he had inherited, enough room to breathe. The Stoic cosmology held that the logos the rational fire, the organizing principle of all things, was not remote. It was not a god who had created the world and retreated. It was present in everything, right now, moving through the cedar and the bronze and the air and the human mind with the same unhurried sufficiency. To reason carefully, to examine one's opinions honestly, to distinguish what is genuinely within one's power from what only appears to be. These were not acts of separation from the world. They were acts of alignment with its deepest structure. The philosopher and the cosmos were participating in the same principle. The quiet in the tent at Carnuntum, when Marcus put down his stylus and sat for a moment before sleep, was not the quiet of withdrawal. It was the quiet of a mind that had, at least for this hour, arrived at the kind of alignment the Stoics meant by living according to nature. It is worth pausing on what Chrysippus had done for this tradition, the specific quality of his contribution, because it is easy, from a distance, to think of philosophical architecture as a merely academic achievement. Chrysippus wrote prolifically, and much of what he wrote has not survived. But what can be reconstructed suggests a thinker of exceptional thoroughness, who understood that the practical Stoic practices, the evening review, the morning preparation, the dichotomy of control, the view from above, would not hold their shape without an underlying account of reality to hold them. The ancient verdict attributed to various sources was direct. If there were no Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa. What this means in practical terms is that when Marcus wrote in his tent about the smallness of human quarrels against the backdrop of cosmic time, he was not improvising. He was drawing on an account of the cosmos, the asterisk logos, asterisk as rational fire, the periodic cycles of creation and dissolution, the rational principle pervading all things that had been worked out with considerable philosophical care by someone who understood that the meditative exercises and the cosmological commitments were not separable. The meditation works because the cosmology is true, or at least because the person meditating holds it to be true, with enough genuine commitment to allow it to do its work. What does it feel like to hold this view with genuine commitment? The question is worth asking because the Stoics were insistent that philosophy was not primarily a matter of knowing the arguments. Epictetus was particularly blunt on this point. A person who could recite the Stoic analysis of impressions and assent without having internalized it in their behavior, who could tell you exactly what Chrysippus said about the dichotomy of control, while continuing to be destroyed by things outside their control, was, in Epictetus's view, not a philosopher at all. They were a scholar of philosophy, which is a different thing, and not the thing that helps when the ship goes down. What helps when the ship goes down is having genuinely practiced the act of locating one's freedom in the right place daily until the locating becomes rapid and reliable rather than effortful and uncertain. This is what Epictetus taught in Nicopolis to students who had traveled considerable distances to sit on wooden benches and be asked again and again to examine the gap between what they said they believed and how they actually lived. He was not gentle about this gap. He was not interested in making his students feel good about themselves. He was interested in making his students free, actually free, in the precise Stoic sense, which meant liberated from the automatic enslavement to appearances and outcomes that characterized most human lives. And the instrument of that liberation was not inspiration or feeling, but patient, relentless, daily practice of making the right distinctions. Arrian, sitting in those lectures, wrote down what Epictetus said in a form that preserved not just the content, but something of the tone, the directness, the occasional exasperation, the deep seriousness that lay beneath the sometimes blunt pedagogy. And Rusticus, passing those notes to Marcus, was passing him something more than a text. He was passing him a method, a practice, a set of exercises that could be done in the morning before the day's demands arrived, and in the evening after they had been met or not met, and in the small gaps of the campaign, and the court, and the endless administrative machinery of the largest organized state in the known world. The exercises worked in those gaps. That was what made them useful to a man who had very little time and very large burdens. They did not require a school, or a porch, or an afternoon free of obligation. They required only a mind willing to look honestly at what it was doing and to make again the basic distinction between what was genuinely within its power and what only appeared to be. In the opening lines of the asterisk Enchiridion asterisk, Epictetus had said, "Some things are in our control, others are not. In our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion. Not in our control are the body, property, reputation, command, everything not our own action. The things in our control are by nature free, unhindered, unimpeded. The things not in our control are weak, enslaved, subject to hindrance. If one confuses what is one's own with what is not, one will be hindered and troubled. One will find fault with both gods and men. But if one takes as one's own only what is truly one's own, then no one will ever compel you. No one will hinder you. You will blame no one, accuse no one, do nothing against your will. You will have no enemies. No one will harm you, because no harm can touch you. The door to freedom, he said in one form or another many times, is always open. This claim, stated plainly, can sound like a kind of triumphalism, as if Epictetus were proposing that a sufficiently enlightened Stoic becomes invulnerable beyond the reach of circumstance entirely. He was not proposing that. He knew too well, from personal experience, that the body can be held and the body can be hurt. He was proposing something more precise and more interesting, that the asterisk assent, asterisk, the internal act by which the mind endorses an impression and makes it the basis for emotion and action, is always in principle the practitioner's own. The impression arrives uninvited. The pain is real. The loss is real. But the interpretation, the judgment that this loss constitutes a catastrophe, that this pain defeats me, that this insult touches what I genuinely am, that interpretation is not forced. It can, with practice, be examined. It can be held up in the light and asked whether it is accurate. And in that examination, in that moment between the impression and the assent, is the space in which a human being is most free. Marcus returned to this space in his writing, again and again, the way a craftsperson returns to a tool they trust. He did not always succeed in locating the freedom Epictetus described. His notebooks are honest enough to record the failures, the irritations that overwhelmed the philosophical response, the mornings when he had to instruct himself again because the instruction had not yet become effortless. But the practice of returning, the daily, faithful, unillusioned practice of returning to the distinction, of attempting again to locate the ruling faculty in a position of genuine composure rather than reactive urgency, that practice was continuous. That was the school, not a building in Athens or a porch or a room in Nicopolis, but the practice itself, carried inside a person across 5 centuries, from a shipwreck off the coast of somewhere, through a generation of students on wooden benches in Nicopolis, into a tent on the Danube frontier, where a man was writing in Greek by lamplight, keeping the tradition alive, the only way it ever actually stays alive, by living it. The painted porch was gone by Marcus's time. The specific building where Zeno had first spoken, beneath those frescoes of famous battles, had long since changed and been rebuilt, and was no longer a site of philosophical teaching. The battles in the frescoes, Marathon, Troy had receded into the distance that swallows even famous battles given enough time. But the observation that had been made in that place remained in circulation, passed from teacher to student across the generations, carried in notes and letters and the private notebooks of people who found it true that what survives the wreck is not the cargo, but the quality of the mind that responds to the wreck. That freedom is not a condition of external circumstances, but a practice of internal ones, that the door is always open. Above the Danube, above the camp, above the lamplight in the tent where Marcus had set down his stylus for the night, the stars moved in their courses. They had been moving in those courses while the Stoa Poikile was being built, and while Chrysippus was writing, and while Epictetus was teaching on his wooden benches, and while Arrian was setting down the words that would eventually reach a Roman emperor who needed them. They would continue moving long after the tent was gone, long after the camp was gone, long after the frontier itself had dissolved into the general impermanence that the Stoics had always understood to be the nature of things. The asterisk logos, asterisk the rational principle, the Stoics had identified with the cosmos itself, moved through all of it in the way it always had, unhurried, undisturbed, asking nothing, holding everything, available to any mind that was still enough, and attentive enough, to find it where it had always been. Marcus is rereading what he has written. The entry sits in his notebook in Greek, in a hand that has grown more compressed over the years of campaign, and the line he has arrived at tells him to look down from above, from some vantage that does not yet have a name, at the festivals, voyages, and wars of humankind. He reads it the way a person might test a rope before trusting weight to it, not doubtfully, carefully. He wants to know if it still holds. It is not the first time he has returned to this particular instruction. The asterisk meditations asterisk are full of passages Marcus seems to have written once and then circled back to, as if checking their work. This one has a quality the others share, only in glimpses. It is not an observation, but a direction. It does not say something about the world. It says, go there, stand in that place, see what can be seen from there, and see if what troubled you this morning is still its same size. He sets the page flat against the table and rests his hand on it for a moment, feeling the wax cool beneath his palm. The practice he is returning to is not a metaphor, though it uses the imagination as its instrument. Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher who spent many of the most patient years of his scholarly life reading the asterisk meditations asterisk in the original Greek, argued this distinction carefully and held it carefully, because the difference matters. A metaphor is a way of describing something. What Marcus is doing when he surveys the circling stars, as though positioned in their midst, is something else, an attempt to actually move one's perceiving self into a different location, to shift the ground from which experience occurs, until the shift becomes something genuinely felt, rather than merely conceived. Hadot called this a practice of asterisk physics, asterisks enacted through imagination, and the label is precise. Physics, in Stoic thought, is not what it would later become. It is the study of nature in its full extent, the rational structure of the whole, the asterisk logos, asterisk moving through everything it has made. To practice physics is to place oneself imaginatively within that whole, and to feel the proportions it implies. It is less like reading a map and more like standing in a country one has previously only heard described, and letting the actual scale of the horizon do something to one's sense of dimension. Marcus had a word for the obstacle the practice is designed to address. The Stoics called it asterisk fantasia, asterisk the impression that arrives before judgment, the automatic, unexamined presentation of an event to the mind in whatever emotional register the mind's habitual responses produce. A piece of bad news arrives, and something happens before any thinking occurs. The news lands with a weight, a color, a sense of scale, and that weight and color and scale feel like facts. They feel like the thing itself. The asterisk fantasia asterisk is not a lie, but it is also not complete. It is the event as seen from one particular angle, one particular distance, with one particular history of expectations and vulnerabilities supplying the frame. What follows the asterisk fantasia asterisk in Stoic psychology is asterisk synchetathesis asterisk assent, the mind's agreement with the impression, its decision, usually swift and often unconscious, that the impression is accurate, that the event is as large or as threatening or as permanent as it first appeared. Most of the suffering that can be addressed by philosophy lives in the space between impression and assent, in the small and ordinary moment when the mind might pause, might refuse to ratify automatically what it has been handed, might ask whether another angle of vision would show a different shape. The view from above is designed for exactly that space. It has a structure, and the structure is not arbitrary. Hadot traced it carefully through the asterisk meditations, noting the way Marcus moves through it, not always explicitly, not always with every stage named, but consistently enough that the pattern becomes legible as a deliberate philosophical method rather than a rhetorical habit. The movement begins close. It begins at the source of difficulty, the frustration, the worry, the thing that has been occupying the foreground of awareness and filling it the way a hand fills the visual field when it is held an inch from the face. That proximity is not wrong, but it is the whole problem, which is to say, it makes proportion impossible. When something is that close, it is not experienced as one thing among many things. It is experienced as everything. So the practice withdraws. Gently and without hurrying, it moves the point of perception back. The immediate concern becomes visible as part of a day. The day becomes visible as part of a life. The life becomes part of a city, a province, a civilization, a span of centuries in which countless people carried their own concerns with equal conviction and equal urgency, and are now entirely gone, along with the concerns, along with the urgency. The civilization becomes part of a species. The species becomes a feature on a small, warm planet. The planet becomes a point of light in a solar system. The solar system becomes one detail in a galaxy of such arrangements, and the galaxy is itself only one among an uncountable number. And at that distance, if the imagination will go there and stay there long enough to actually feel the scale, rather than merely register it, the thing that was filling the foreground of the mind this morning has become something else entirely. It has become small, not dismissed, not falsified, not denied its real existence or its real effects, but small in the way things are small from a genuine distance, which is to say, small in proportion to everything else, rather than inflated by the accident of proximity. Hadot's contribution was to insist that this was not merely a rhetorical exercise, not a technique for generating impressive-sounding descriptions of cosmic vastness. He had read enough of the asterisk meditations asterisk to know that Marcus was not performing the view from above for any reader. The notebooks were private. No one was meant to see them. The entries are reminders, sometimes almost commands, from Marcus to Marcus, written in a hand that clearly expected the writer to return to them and attempt again to do the thing they describe. The repetitions in the text are evidence of what genuine practice looks like, not mastery, not a technique applied once and then transcended, but a reliable instrument returned to regularly, the way a person returns to the same cold water at the same morning hour, not because they have forgotten the sensation, but because the sensation still works, still does what it is there to do. Marcus writes in Book 6 that one should survey the circling stars as though you yourself were in mid-course with them. The preposition matters, not asterisk as if watching from above asterisk, but asterisk in mid-course with them, asterisk as if movement itself had changed, as if one were no longer standing still on the surface of a difficulty, but already in motion with something much older and much larger than the difficulty, caught in the long, steady turning that has been underway for longer than any particular suffering can remember. The stars are not a backdrop. They are the actual condition of the exercise. The attention must go to them and stay with them until the movement of the attention itself changes, slows, takes on something of their quality, which is patient and enormous, and entirely without urgency, because nothing in their courses has ever been urgent, and they have been turning at their measured pace through everything that has ever happened, in ways that will continue long after every present difficulty has dissolved back into the materials from which it was briefly assembled. There is a moment in this practice when something shifts. Hedot was careful about this moment, and Marcus seems to have been careful about it too, which is perhaps why he kept returning to write his way toward it. The shift is not guaranteed by effort. It is not produced by willing it hard enough. It is more like the moment in a long, patient walk when the city one has been walking away from is no longer audible, when one notices, without having decided to notice, that the background noise has gone, that what surrounds one now is something quieter and wider, and that the body has adjusted to this without requiring permission. The shift in the view from above has this involuntary quality. One holds the imagined perspective. One attempts to actually see from it, rather than merely describe seeing from it. And then sometimes, without announcement, the concern that was occupying the foreground of consciousness is briefly, accurately, genuinely small, not shrunk by effort, but seen in proportion for the first time, as if the proportion were always there, and only the closeness had hidden it. Marcus was in a military camp when he wrote many of these passages. The Danube was near. There were fires. There were dispatches about the border, about the tribes pressing in from the north, about the supply lines that were always inadequate in a campaign that had gone on longer than anyone at the beginning would have accepted. There were names of men who had died, and names of men who were going to die. And in the background of all of it, always, throughout these years, the administrative correspondence that never stopped, the petitions and legal decisions, and provincial matters that followed an emperor, even to the frontier, because the empire did not pause for a man's philosophical practice. And Marcus was not under the impression that it should. He paused anyway. He wrote anyway. He attempted the view from above, from a field table in a military tent, while the sounds of the camp settled around him in the dark, and the repetitions in the notebook suggest that he did not always succeed, that on many nights the practice did not produce the shift, that the frustrations and griefs and bureaucratic exhaustions remained their close-range size. The notebooks record this too, in a way, in the continued need to return, in the instructions addressed to himself with a firmness that implies the instruction was being resisted, in the occasional passage that reads less like philosophical reflection and more like a man talking himself back toward a position he has temporarily lost sight of and knows, from experience, he can find again if he keeps going in the right direction. The Stephen Hayes comparison is worth holding briefly because it illuminates something that the historical distance sometimes obscures. Hayes, working in the late 20th century, within what would become acceptance and commitment therapy, developed a technique he called cognitive diffusion, a set of practices designed to create distance between a person and the automatic thoughts that structure their distress. The core insight is the same one the Stoics had worked with for centuries, that a thought is not the same as the thing it is about, that the automatic narrative the mind produces in response to a difficulty is a representation rather than the difficulty itself, and that the mind that has been taught to observe its own representations rather than immediately inhabiting them has purchased a freedom that the unreflective mind does not have. Hayes arrived at this through clinical research and empirical observation. Marcus arrived at it through Epictetus and through years of practice on a frontier that gave him more occasion for it than most people encounter in a lifetime. The fact that two such different routes arrive at the same structural insight is not coincidence. It suggests that both are responding to something real, a reproducible feature of how minds process difficulty that does not change much between Rome in the 2nd century and California in the 20th. But Hayes was working in a clinic, and Marcus was working in a tradition. The tradition matters because it gives the practice its full weight. Cognitive diffusion is a technique in service of psychological well-being. The view from above is a technique in service of something the Stoics would have called living according to nature, which means living according to reason, which means living in accordance with the asterisk logos, asterisk that organizes and pervades everything that exists. The distinction changes the quality of the practice. When Marcus moves his perspective outward through the stages of the exercise, he is not merely creating psychological distance from a difficult thought. He is placing himself imaginatively and then by genuine felt experience within the rational order of things inside the asterisk logos, asterisk itself, understood as the intelligence moving through the stars in their courses and through the Danube in its current and through the rational faculty of a tired emperor in a military tent trying to see clearly before the lamp goes out. Hadot had a phrase for the condition this practice is trying to produce. He called it the cosmic yes. It is worth sitting with that phrase rather than moving past it, because it contains more than it first appears to carry. The cosmic yes is not agreement with everything that happens, not the erasure of judgment or the abandonment of preference. Marcus had strong preferences. He preferred peace to war. He preferred philosophy to administration. He preferred his children well, and his empire stable, and the border quiet. The cosmic yes does not require the abandonment of these preferences. What it requires is a willing acceptance of one's place within the whole, a genuine felt recognition that this particular life, in this particular moment, in this particular set of circumstances, is part of an arrangement that extends so far in every direction that no single element of it, however painful, is the entirety of it. The grief is real, the frustration is real, the difficulty is real, but it is real within a context so vast that the context itself changes the quality of the reality. The way a single note of music is real as a sound, but becomes something else entirely when it is part of a chord, and the chord is part of a progression, and the progression is part of a piece that has been playing for longer than the note knew. A concern held close to the face fills the entire field of vision. This is simply how vision works. Proximity creates apparent scale, creates the sensation that what is near is also large, that what is large is also the most significant thing present. Marcus had bureaucratic frustrations. He had the Antonine Plague moving through his cities. He had barbarian pressure on every northern frontier, and a co-emperor who had died and left him the sole figure of an arrangement that was designed for two. He had philosophical aspirations he had not asked to have interrupted by an empire, and the empire pressed constantly from every side with urgency and weight and the specific gravity of things that cannot be refused. All of this was held close. All of it had the apparent scale of everything on the days when he had not yet done the work. The practice moves all of it back, not away, back. The concern remains visible. It has not been made to disappear, but from a distance that the imagination, carefully trained, can actually sustain, it becomes what it always was, and could not be seen as, when it was held an inch from the eye. One thing among many things in a world so large and so old that the very largeness and oldness of it are, if one holds them long enough, a kind of company. The stars were there before the difficulty. They will be there after. They move at their pace through circumstances that include the difficulty the way a river includes a stone on its bed, present, real, unmoved by the moving water, and in the longer view, simply part of what the river is. Marcus paused in his tent before his notebook and attempted it again. He put down his stylus. He stilled the habit of close observation that had served him well all day in every official and administrative task that required close observation. He drew his attention back and back and back from the immediate entry he had been composing, outward to the page, to the table, to the tent, to the camp with its fires and its sounds, to the dark plain beyond the camp, to the Danube running unseen in the dark, to the territory beyond the river, to the whole known extent of the empire, from Britain to Mesopotamia, to the curve of the earth that held all of it, to the blackness above the curve where the stars were doing what they had always done. He held that for as long as it held. The practice requires patience with failure. This is perhaps its most honest feature, and the one Marcus seems to have been most honest with himself about. The notebooks do not record a philosopher who has mastered the view from above and now employs it easily. They record someone working and reworking and returning and finding that the instrument is reliable even when the practitioner is tired, that it does not require perfect conditions or a particularly quiet mind or the absence of grief. It requires only the willingness to begin again from wherever one is, to put aside for a moment the close-range version of reality that habit and exhaustion and worry have been constructing all day, and to try, once more, to see from somewhere farther out. The staged movement is worth tracing again, more slowly, because the pace matters. It begins with what is actually present, the specific frustration, the specific worry, the specific thing that has been taking up the available room in the mind's foreground. Not a generalized difficulty, not an abstract category of problem, but this one, the one that arrived today in this particular form and has been occupying the space in front of the face ever since. The practice does not ask that it be dismissed or minimized. It begins by acknowledging that it is there and that it seems as large as it seems. Then the attention moves back and the individual day becomes visible around the event. The day is long and contains many things that are not the difficult thing, things that happened quietly, without urgency, and were so ordinary that they registered barely at all. The morning had a color. There was weather. There were small transactions with other people that went unremarked because they went well. The event is still present and still significant, but now it is in a day rather than being the day. Then the attention continues to withdraw, and the individual life becomes visible around the day. The life has a shape, a beginning that the person at its center could not have chosen, a series of turns that were partly chosen and partly simply what the circumstances produced. A current moment that feels from inside it like the essential moment, but which, from the distance of the whole life, is simply one in a long sequence. The event is still present. It has not been falsified, but it is in a life now, rather than being the life. Then the attention moves further, and the individual life becomes part of a civilizational history, and the civilizational history becomes part of a species, and the species becomes part of a geological record that will not notice the species for very long, and the geological record is part of an astronomical story so long that no unit of human time corresponds to any meaningful fraction of it. At this distance, the thing that was filling the foreground of the mind this morning is genuinely small, not because it is unimportant to the person it belongs to, but because importance itself is scale dependent, and at scales this large, the scaling changes everything. And then, if the practice works, if the imagination has been patient enough, and the attention has genuinely moved, rather than merely been described as having moved, there is the stillness, Hadot called the cosmic yes, the willingness to be, without reservation or complaint, where one actually is, within this particular life, at this particular moment, in the middle of this particular difficulty, and to recognize, not as an intellectual concession, but as a felt experience that has come from somewhere beyond the intellect, that this is enough, that being a temporary arrangement of matter and attention within a cosmos of such extent that no temporary arrangement of matter and attention can comprehend its full scope, is, given the alternative, something worth consenting to. This does not resolve the difficulty. The Stoics were not in the business of resolution. The practice does not promise that the bad news will be reversed, that the frustrating circumstance will change, that the person who has behaved badly will improve. It makes no guarantees about the world outside the mind. What it addresses is the close-range version of the world that the unreflective mind produces by default, and the suffering that the close-range version generates, not because the world is as difficult as it seems, but because the proximity itself is generating apparent scale that does not survive the view from further out. Marcus returned to this practice for years. He returned to it in Rome, and at Carnuntum, and at Sirmium, and wherever the campaigns took him, in tents and in palaces, in the small hours of difficult nights when the empire's problems had the weight of the empire behind them, and the philosophical practice was the only instrument he trusted to restore the proportion. The weight had distorted. He did not always succeed. He wrote often enough of his own failures, his own tendency to be drawn back into the close range by anger or flattery, or the simply human difficulty of seeing one's own circumstances from outside them. The notebooks record the effort more faithfully than the achievement, and which is perhaps why they have survived all these centuries, still feeling useful, because they are not a record of mastery, but a record of practice, and practice is available to anyone who is willing to begin again, from wherever they are, as many times as the day requires. There is something in the image of Marcus in his tent, the camp sound settling into the particular quiet of a Roman military camp late at night, the lamp burning lower, the notebook open on the table that carries the full weight of what the practice asks and what it offers. It asks the willingness to stop in the middle of everything that presses for continued attention and to deliberately move one's perceiving self to a different location. It asks patience with the failure to arrive there on the first attempt, and with the second, and with the many attempts that produce not the genuine shift, but only the mechanical rehearsal of its stages. It asks over the long run, the kind of faith in a practice that can only be earned by having done the practice enough times to know that it works. Not always, not on demand, not in every condition, but often enough and reliably enough that the return to it makes sense even on the nights when it will not work. What it offers, in return, is the view, not a comfortable view, not a view that flattens the difficulty or pretends that the world is simpler than it is, but a view from far enough out that the proportions are accurate rather than distorted by proximity, and proportion is most of what the suffering mind needs, and least of what it, left to itself, naturally finds. The stars above the Danube frontier in the 2nd century were the same stars they had always been. They moved at their pace through the dark, in the patient arcs that the asterisk logos, asterisk had been tracing through them since before any human being had thought to look up and ask what the movement meant. Marcus looked up from his notebook toward them, or he looked up in the only way available to him, inward and outward at once, through the instrument of a careful imagination that had been trained by years of practice to carry the perceiving self beyond the tent, beyond the camp, beyond the dark plain and the river and the frontier, outward through the stages of a practiced withdrawal, until the whole visible and invisible world was present, and the small lit camp was part of it, one small warm thing in all that moving dark, the fires burning in their ordinary way, the river making its own sounds in the distance, the stars turning in their courses without effort, without urgency, at a pace that has no need for anything to be otherwise than it is. The view from above does not require standing somewhere other than where one stands. It requires only the willingness to keep moving the attention back and back and back until the whole comes into view, and the whole vast and impersonal and suffused throughout with the patient intelligence the Stoics called the asterisk logos. Asterisk offers what it has always offered to the mind that can receive it, not comfort exactly and not resolution, but the cosmic yes, the quiet, open, willing recognition that this is the place and this is the moment, and the moment is part of something that needs nothing added to it. The stars are out, the practice is working, or it is not yet working, and either way the practice continues. The camp settles, the river runs, the whole enormous arrangement goes on, doing what it has always done, in the dark, in the light, at every distance, holding without preference or ceremony all the temporary and urgent and real small things that burn briefly within it. Marcus was writing by lamplight when he arrived at the phrase about time being a river. He did not revise it. He did not reach back to rework the sentence or test a different figure. He set down the stylus and remained with what he had written, the way a person remains with something heard in a quiet room, not to examine it further, but because the examination is already complete, and what follows is something slower than thought. The lamp held its small circle of light around his hands and the open page. Outside the tent, the Danube moved in the dark, carrying whatever it was carrying, indifferent to what it was called. The phrase stayed with him, not as an achievement, but as an accuracy. Time is a river of vanishing moments. He had not invented the feeling the words pointed at. He had found words adequate to a feeling already known, which is a different kind of work, and in some ways a harder one. The river was not a metaphor he had chosen for elegance. He had perhaps sat beside the actual river at Carnuntum, in the pauses that military campaigns allow, and watched water pass that was already not the water it had been a moment before, and understood that the thing called the Danube was a name laid over a continuous disappearing, that what he was watching was not a thing, but a process, wearing the appearance of a thing, the way a flame seems solid, until one looks at it long enough. What he brought back from the riverbank was not a literary comparison, it was a direct observation about the structure of time itself, which had the river in it because the river was simply there and true. He wrote, also, that the span of all human history was a pinprick of eternity, not the lifetime of a man, but all of it. The full catalogue of kings and wars and harvests and plagues and children born and cities built and fires set deliberately to bring the cities down. The whole of it, set against the scale Marcus was attempting to hold in mind, reduced to something that could be covered by the tip of a finger. This was not despair. The style guide of a despairing man does not produce the kind of prose the Meditations contains. Careful, unhurried, returning to the same questions across years with the patience of someone who finds the questions worth returning to. Marcus was not despairing when he wrote about the pinprick. He was doing something more like a physician does when measuring a wound accurately, not to frighten the patient, but because accurate measurement is the first condition of useful treatment. The treatment here was perspective. The wound was the tyranny of the immediate. Every generation of human beings has experienced the immediate as enormous. The quarrel that happened yesterday, the official who made the wrong decision last week, the project that failed, the recognition withheld, the slight remembered long after the occasion has passed, these fill the field of vision completely. When held close enough, they have the weight of the world because, held at that distance, they are the world. What Marcus was attempting, in himself, was not to dismiss these things or pretend they carried no real weight. It was something more precise, to move them to their accurate distance, and then to judge their weight from there. The temporal scale he used for this was not arbitrary. He had inherited from the Stoic tradition before him a framework for thinking about time that was both philosophically rigorous and cosmologically vast. The Stoics had argued that the universe moved through great cycles, that the cosmos periodically dissolved, in an event they called the ekpyrosis, back into the primal fire of the rational principle that pervaded and organized all things, and that from this dissolution a new cosmos arose, following the same patterns, expressing the same rational structure, playing out the same broad strokes of history in a reconstituted world. The joys and sorrows and ambitions and failures were not unique to any generation. They were the recurring expressions of a nature that had always produced these things and would again in the immense rolling repetition of cosmic time. Marcus drew something useful from this picture. If the same broad patterns of human life, the same vanities, the same hungers, the same reaching after permanence in things that do not hold it, repeated across every civilization that had ever existed and every civilization that would ever exist, then the particular instance of the pattern that happened to belong to the 2nd century of the Roman Empire was not especially weighty. It was one iteration among uncountable others. It was real. It was not trivial. But it was not singular, and the weight that singularity would have added, the weight of being the only moment that had ever mattered, the irreplaceable crisis that had no precedent and would have no successor, that weight could be set down. He had a practice for this. It was not abstract. He would take specific names, the names of emperors, men of real power who had stood where he stood and done what he was doing, and ask after them, where now is Vespasian, where is Trajan, who pushed the frontier further east than anyone before him? Where is Hadrian, who traveled the whole extent of the empire in person, who built the wall in the north of Britain, who loved a young man with such completeness that when the young man drowned in the Nile, Hadrian named a city for him and grieved in a way that puzzled his court? Where are all of them? Gone. Not diminished, not forgotten in the ordinary sense. Their names persisted, their monuments remained, their policies had shaped the world Marcus had inherited, but they themselves, the particular quality of consciousness that had looked out from behind their eyes, the precise texture of what it was to be Trajan or Hadrian moving through a specific afternoon in a specific year, that was gone with a completeness that nothing could revise. The empire they had built was there. They were not. Marcus was not naming them to despair at impermanence or to conclude that nothing mattered because nothing lasted. He was naming them because the exercise had a specific effect on the interior of whoever performed it honestly. To hold in mind the fullness of Trajan, the campaigns, the column built to commemorate them, the administrative genius, the genuine regard his contemporaries felt for him, and then to hold in mind the completeness of his absence was to perform a kind of calibration. The scale adjusted. The urgency that daily political life generated, the sense that what happened today in the Senate or on the frontier was uniquely, catastrophically important, was not eliminated by the exercise, but it was made proportional. It was returned to its actual size in the long view, which was still a real size, but not the size it felt when held an inch from the face. There is a double quality to this practice that is easy to miss on a first reading. Marcus was not only humbling himself, though he was doing that, reminding himself that the same process which had erased emperors far more celebrated than he was already running under the surface of his own days, and that nothing he built would be exempt from it. He was also finding in that recognition something that functioned, if not as comfort exactly, then as company. The men whose names he recited had suffered before him. They had carried what he was carrying, the weight of an empire that was always in the process of being held together, always one decision away from a frontier unraveling, always making do with the imperfect instruments that human beings are, and the patient indifference of time had received them and moved on. The same patient indifference was available to Marcus. The same release eventually would come. What the practice named but did not dramatize was the fact that this release had already come for everyone who had ever suffered urgently about something that now seemed, from the vantage of a few centuries, minor or even invisible. The entire generation of Romans who had experienced the crisis of the late Republic, the assassinations, the civil wars, that the years when the question of what the Roman state even was remained genuinely open, that generation had suffered those things with the complete subjective intensity of people for whom the crisis filled the whole horizon. And now they were not even names to most of the people living in the empire Marcus governed. They were dust, their anxieties with them, their sense of unprecedented emergency dissolved entirely into the ordinary passage of time. Marcus did not find this nihilistic. The Meditations is not the notebook of a man who has concluded that nothing matters because nothing lasts. It is, if anything, the opposite, the notebook of a man who has used the scale of impermanence to identify more precisely what actually matters, by finding what remains when the merely urgent has been dissolved. What remained after the emperors and the crises and the urgencies and the generations had passed through Marcus's contemplation and emerged diminished was the quality of the choices made within each day, not the outcome of those choices, which time would process with its usual indifference, the quality of the choosing itself. He wrote in Book 8, in a passage whose shape carries what Carl Sagan would independently arrive at in a different century, with a photograph taken from the edge of the solar system, that the entire extent of the known world, not just Rome, but all the cities and territories and peoples that Rome's geography included, occupied a vanishingly small corner of the cosmos. The empire that had required so much to build and required so much to hold together was set against astronomical distance, a mark on a surface too small to describe accurately. The politics that filled Marcus's days, the dispatches from the frontier, and the petitions in the courtroom, and the negotiations with people whose interests ran perpendicular to the interests of everyone else, all of it was happening in a space that would be invisible to any perspective broad enough to matter to the cosmos itself. This is the gesture that the Stoic practice of the view from above makes available, and makes available repeatedly as a renewable resource rather than a one-time insight. The vastness is not deployed as a rhetorical flourish. Here is how small you are. Is that not humbling? But as a genuine cognitive instrument, the mind that can actually hold, even briefly, the perspective from which the entire inhabited world is small, has been given something that changes the texture of what it returns to. The bureaucratic frustration, the difficult colleague, the intractable political problem, the thing that seemed before the exercise to occupy the full extent of the available mental space, these remain real and still require attention and still deserve the best judgment Marcus can bring to them. But they have been placed. They exist now within a context that makes their actual weight available for assessment, and their actual weight, most of the time, is considerably less than the weight they carry when held close in the dark, with no context around them. Outside the tent at Carnuntum, the sky was enormous and indifferent. The stars that Marcus could see on a clear night above the Danube were the same stars Trajan had seen from the same frontier. They were the same stars, broadly speaking, that Zeno had seen from Athens when the Stoic tradition was still young, still finding the arguments that would carry it forward. The light they cast had left its sources long before any of these men were born, and would arrive at any eye looking up long after all of them were gone. There was something in this that Marcus returned to, not as melancholy, but as ground. The stars did not care about the empire. The stars did not care about anything in the sense that care implies preference. They moved in their courses according to the rational principle that the Stoics had argued pervaded all things, and the moving was not aimed at any particular result, and the not aiming was not emptiness, but something more like completeness. It needed nothing added to it. The river that ran beside the camp moved in the same way. Marcus had written about it, the river of vanishing moments, but it was also a literal river, the Danube, dark and cold and heavy with whatever the northern winter had put into it, passing the Roman encampment with the same complete indifference to Roman affairs that it had maintained through whatever civilizations had camped beside it before Rome arrived, and would maintain through whatever would come after. The legions could build a wall of forts along its length. They could name it and map it and argue about what lay on the far side of it. The river did not record any of this. It moved through it all the way it moved through everything, continuously, without remainder, taking nothing forward and leaving nothing behind. There is a version of this observation that becomes oppressive, that accumulates into the kind of weight from which sleep becomes impossible rather than available. Marcus did not live in that version. The key was in what he chose to hold next to the river, next to the vanishing of the emperors, next to the pinprick of human history in the immensity of time. He held next to these things the fact that within the river, within the vanishing, within the immensity, there was a specific kind of action available to the person standing at the edge, a quality of attention, a quality of choosing, a quality of regard for the people immediately around him, difficult, flawed, sometimes dishonest, sometimes frightened, always deserving of the same patient quality of engagement he tried to bring to the philosophical work that was not made meaningless by its brevity. If anything, the brevity was what gave the quality of the action its weight, not because it would be remembered, but because it was real while it was happening, and then it was over, and what it had been was permanently what it had been. Marcus was not building toward a conclusion with this. He was not working through a chain of argument that was going to produce, at the end, a position to be defended. He was using the temporal and spatial scale of the Stoic framework, the way an instrument is used, as a way of producing a specific adjustment in the interior of the person who applies it honestly. The adjustment was not insight in the philosophical sense. It was more like a physical change in the relationship between the practicing mind and the concerns that had been pressing against it. The concerns were still there. The mind was still doing what it was meant to do, attending to them, making judgments about them, deciding how to respond. But the pressing had eased. The sense of emergency had been returned to its accurate scale. And in the space that opened when the emergency contracted to its actual size, something else became available. A quality of attention that was not hurried, not defensive, not in the grip of a felt urgency that was out of proportion to whatever had generated it. He named this in the Meditations by listing what he intended to do each morning. The list is not complicated. He intended to meet difficult people with the quality of attention they deserved. He intended to remember when they were meddling or ungrateful or dishonest, that they were as much expressions of the rational principle that pervaded all things as he was, that their capacity for reason was the same as his, even when they were failing to use it well, that the failing was part of the pattern, and the pattern was larger than any of them. This was not a performance of tolerance. It was a genuine philosophical position about the nature of human action, grounded in the Stoic claim that no one chooses to reason badly, that the person who acts wrongly acts from a kind of darkness, a failure of vision, rather than from a free choice to do what they know to be wrong. The anger this position dissolved was real anger, the kind that accumulates from being in positions of power, where people disappoint the expectations power generates, and the practice of dissolving it through the temporal scale and the view from above and the morning preparation and the evening review was not a performance of patience Marcus had already achieved. It was a practice he was still practicing and still failing and still returning to. The whole of Book 4 carries the quality of a man who has looked at time long enough to feel it as something other than a threat. The passages about the river and the pinprick and the vanished emperors do not read like a man frightening himself into perspective. They read like a man who has found, through repeated honest looking, that the things he used to find threatening in the scale of time have gradually become, with enough familiarity, something closer to restful. The river is still running. The emperors are still gone. The pinprick is still a pinprick. But these facts, held by a mind that has spent years becoming acquainted with them, no longer carry the charge they might have carried at the first encounter. They have become, over time, what the Danube itself had become to the men who camped beside it long enough. Not a symbol, not a philosophical figure, but simply a feature of the landscape, present and continuous, and asking nothing particular from anyone. The Stoic cosmological framework held that this was not accidental. The universe was structured by a rational principle that was identical with the rational principle in the human mind, which meant that when Marcus looked up at the stars and felt the scale they carried, he was not looking at something alien to himself. He was looking at an expression of the same logos that expressed itself in his capacity to reason, to judge, to return to a question with patience and bring it back with fresh attention. The cosmos was not indifferent to him in the sense of being hostile or empty. It was indifferent in the way that a large, ordered, ongoing thing is indifferent to any particular instance of itself, not because the instance is unimportant, but because the principle that generates the instance is already completely present in every iteration of it. The rational principle was not more fully present in the stars than it was in Marcus. It was present in both, completely, in the way a geometric principle is present completely in every figure that instantiates it. This is why the scale, for Marcus, was not vertigo. The person who looks up at the immensity of the sky and feels it as a threat, as an argument for human insignificance, as evidence that nothing is worth caring about, is looking at the same stars, but has not yet completed the observation. What Marcus found, by following the Stoic cosmology to its conclusion, was that the immensity was not separate from the small lamplit tent, and the careful Greek prose, and the question of how to govern an empire, well in a difficult century. The immensity was the context within which those things had their meaning, not a context that diminished them, but one that placed them accurately, and in placing them accurately, freed them from the distorted weight they had accumulated by being held too close. The vanished emperors had held things too close, too, in their time, or perhaps some of them had not. Perhaps Hadrian, traveling the empire in person and stopping to look at what was actually there, had sometimes found the same perspective Marcus was finding in the tent at Carnuntum. There is no way to know. Their notebooks, if they kept them, are gone. What remains is what they built and what the historians wrote about them, which is a different kind of record from the kind Marcus was keeping, a record not of what was accomplished, but of what the accomplishing cost and required and looked like from the inside. The Meditations is the inside record. It exists because Marcus wrote for himself, in Greek, in a notebook he never showed anyone, in the narrow margins that a life of public obligation left for the private philosophical work. The inside record shows a man who used temporal scale the way a craftsman uses a tool, not to decorate the thinking, but to do actual work on the material of daily life. The material was urgency and distortion and the tyranny of the immediate. The tool was the full duration of time, held honestly in mind until the immediate shrank to its accurate proportions, and what remained was the quality of attention available to someone no longer in the grip of a crisis that was not, when measured against the river, actually a crisis. He looked at the stars above the Danube on the nights when the sky was clear and the camp had settled into its nighttime rhythms, and understood something about what endured. Not the empires, not the names or the monuments or the policies or the specific decisions that had seemed in the moment of their making enormously weighty. What endured was the movement itself, the ordered, patient, uninterrupted progress of the stars through their courses, the running of the river through its banks, the rational principle expressing itself without urgency in the structure of a cosmos that had always been exactly what it was and would continue to be what it was, without requiring anything from any of the minds that occasionally noticed it. And there was something in that continuity, not comfort in the ordinary sense, not the comfort of being told that everything would resolve itself favorably, but something quieter and more durable. The recognition that what endured longest was also what asked the least. The stars did not ask to be seen, the river did not ask to be understood, the cosmos did not ask for Marcus's philosophical cooperation, or for his approval, or for his distress on the occasions when the immediate seemed too heavy. It went on regardless, at its own unhurried pace, through every generation that had stood where he was standing, and looked up with the same question. And it would go on long after the question itself was no longer being asked by anyone on the ground beside the Danube. That recognition, arrived at honestly and held without drama, was what the temporal scale offered. Not an answer to the question of how to govern well, or how to face loss, or how to remain patient with the people whose capacity for disappointing expectation was, in Marcus's experience, apparently unlimited. The temporal scale did not answer those questions. It changed the frame within which they were being asked, and in changing the frame, it changed what kind of answer was being sought. The answer that urgency demands, immediate, total, definitive, became less necessary when the urgency had been reduced to its accurate size. What remained was the question in its quieter form, and the quieter question could be lived with. It could be set down and returned to. It could be carried through a long campaign and a difficult Senate session and a difficult evening entry in a notebook no one would read until long after the camp at Carnuntum was gone. The lamp burned lower. The river ran past in the dark, carrying whatever the night had put into it. Somewhere above the tent, the stars continued their courses, the same stars that would be there after Rome, after whatever came after Rome, after the long attrition of time had processed everything Marcus and his generation were so urgently attending to. They moved without haste and without effort, in the way that things move when they are entirely what they are and have nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. Marcus set down the reed stylus on the edge of the field table. The lamp was burning low. Outside the tent, the sounds of the Roman camp at Carnuntum had slowed to almost nothing. The occasional passage of a night watch, the low breath of wind off the Danube, the river moving in the dark as it had always moved, carrying nothing toward the sea and everything at once. He looked at what he had written, not reading it again for revision, moving through it the way a person moves through familiar rooms at night, touching the walls lightly, checking that the shape of things is still as it should be. The words were his own, addressed to himself, and they were not finished in the way that finished things are finished. They were the record of a practice, still ongoing, a direction being held, day after day, in the approximate way that a lamp holds light, not perfectly, not without occasional guttering, but steadily enough that the room remains visible. He had been writing for years in this manner. The notebooks were private. No audience had been considered, no reader imagined, no posterity invited in. What he had been doing, every morning before the day demanded him, and every evening before the lamp went out, was something closer to practice than to composition. The way an archer draws the bow, not to display the motion, but to refine it. The way a physician presses the wrist, not to learn what the pulse is called, but to know, again, what it feels like under the fingers. The Stoics had a word for the seat of that practice, the asterisk hegemonit. On asterisk, the ruling faculty, the place where impressions arrived, were received or rejected, where judgments were formed and character was, slowly and without ceremony, made. All day long the ruling faculty had been at work, receiving petitions, weighing advisors, adjudicating disputes, performing the endless official business of an empire that stretched from the Scottish lowlands to the Tigris, from the Rhine to the edge of the Sahara. The role had demanded everything the exterior world asks of a person: presence, decisiveness, the performance of authority, and beneath that performance, patient and unhurried, the ruling faculty had been doing its other work, watching, noticing, asking, quietly, whether the judgment forming was accurate or merely habitual, whether the response arising was genuinely considered or merely reactive, whether the emperor performing his public function had remained, underneath the function, a philosopher practicing his. That was the work the notebooks recorded, not the empire's business, the other business, The business of keeping the interior life in reasonable order, of returning each evening to whatever equanimity the day had permitted, of setting down what had been held too tightly and releasing it into the slow philosophical perspective that made it possible to rest. Seneca had described a practice like this. In his writing on anger, he had prescribed a nightly examination, a review conducted not as punishment, but as the accountable act of a person genuinely interested in the distance between who they meant to be and who they had been today. What bad habit had been addressed? What temptation had been noticed and set aside? What failure had been met and named honestly before being released? Seneca recommended this not as a mortification, but as a form of care, the way a good gardener walks the beds at the end of the day, not to punish the plants for what they have not yet become, but to see clearly what the morning's work will ask. Marcus had found the same practice, independently or through the same tradition. It is hard to say. The notebooks were evidence of it. Each entry, a small accounting, each return to a principle, a small act of renewal, each honest acknowledgment of falling short, a small unceremonious act of philosophical courage. He had noted his impatience. He had noted his susceptibility to flattery, that particular weakness of anyone surrounded by those who need something from them. He had noted the days when the morning was too difficult, when the inner resistance to rising and beginning again had been real and not merely described. He had set these things down without drama. He had continued. The asterisk hegemonicon asterisk did not ask to be celebrated for this. It asked only to be returned to a state in which it could do its work clearly. A body needs rest so that it can carry what the next day will bring. The ruling faculty needs something similar, not the cessation of consciousness, but the completion of the day's engagement, the deliberate setting down of what has been carried, the philosophical release of what was never truly one's own to carry in the first place. There is a word in the Stoic tradition for this release, homoiosis the hoi, assimilation to the divine will, or in the more grounded philosophical sense, the active, practiced letting go of resistance to what cannot be changed. It is not resignation in the passive sense. Resignation suggests a defeat, a giving up, a turning away from what was wanted. What the Stoics meant was closer to a clear-eyed recognition, held steadily enough to be felt rather than merely acknowledged, that what lies outside the jurisdiction of the ruling faculty is simply outside it, and no amount of continued effort, continued worry, continued internal friction against the fact of it will bring it within reach. Marcus had written about this in many ways across many entries. He had reached for different angles on the same truth, the way one adjusts a lamp to see a thing from the best available angle. He had written about the dichotomy between what is within our power and what is not, the core instrument he had found in the notes of Epictetus, the teaching of the lame philosopher from Nicopolis, who had lived in slavery and found, inside that condition, a freedom that the condition could not touch. He had written about the shortness of human life and the vast indifference of time. He had written about the view from above, the practice of lifting attention out of the immediate and close into the wide and open, where specific griefs and specific pressures and the specific intractable personalities that had demanded things of him all day became briefly and accurately small. All of this was preparation, not preparation for something that would eventually arrive, but preparation that was itself the practice, the purpose, the thing being cultivated, a direction being kept, not a destination being reached. The lamp burned lower. He did not trim it. The darkness could come. In Rome, long before Carnuntum, long before the frontier and the military tent and the notebooks that no one else had read, There had been a young man who had received a book. It came through the hands of his teacher Quintus Junius Rusticus, who had placed it in front of him without ceremony, the way one places a tool in front of someone who is ready to use it. The book was Arrian's transcription of the lectures of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who had been born enslaved, whose leg had been broken by a master, who had sat through that breaking without crying out, not because he felt nothing, but because he had genuinely located his will in a place the master could not reach, and who had then spent the rest of his life in Nicopolis teaching others that the same location was available to them. What Epictetus had handed down and what Marcus had found waiting for him in that book was a distinction so simple that its full weight takes years to be genuinely felt. Some things are within our power, some things are not. This was not a complicated idea. It could be stated in a single sentence. What made it inexhaustible was not the statement, but the practice of actually applying it, moment by moment, impression by impression, hour by hour, through days that did not make the application easy. The opinions and impulses that arise from within, these are *ham within our power. The body, reputation, political office, the outcomes of actions already taken, the behavior of other people, the movement of history, the turning of the stars, these are not. Placing these two categories clearly and honestly against each other, and then behaving accordingly. This was the work. The work was never finished. It was simply, each day, done again. Marcus had absorbed this early, returned to it constantly, and found that the more honestly he applied it, the larger the territory it cleared. Not a comfortable clearing, the clearing of an accurate view, because when one genuinely sets down the ambition to control what cannot be controlled, what remains is not emptiness, but the ruling faculty in its proper function, attending to what actually belongs to it, which is the quality of its own responses, judgments, and choices, and nothing beyond that. He had also written, in Book 4 of the Notebooks, about time, about the river, sitting somewhere perhaps beside the Danube itself, perhaps in memory of a river seen long before. He had found the image for what the Stoics meant when they spoke of the way the present moment is the only point of genuine contact with existence, and even that point is always passing. Time is a river of vanishing moments. Each one arrives and is gone before it can be fully grasped, replaced by the next, replaced again, the succession so rapid and continuous that what feels like the present is already receding by the time it is noticed. Everything that has ever been named, celebrated, mourned, or built has occurred in this river. The great emperors whose names he could still recite, Vespasian, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, whose hand had shaped his own life, had moved through the same river and were gone from it so completely that their going was now simply part of the pattern, the large and impersonal process that takes the great and the small alike, without preference or ceremony. He had not found this despairing. He had set it down because it was true, and because the truth of it, genuinely held rather than merely acknowledged, did something useful to the weight of present concerns. If the entire known world, with all its politics and pride, occupied a vanishingly small portion of the cosmos, if the span of the longest human life was a pinprick against the immensity of time, then the specific frustrations and pressures of a single day, a single year, a single reign could be released from the category of objective crisis into something more accurate, the category of events that were significant from close range and small from any other range, in which time would eventually dissolve as completely as it had dissolved everything that came before. This was not the same as saying that nothing mattered. The Stoics had never said that nothing mattered. They had said that most of what human beings treat as mattering enormously, reputation, wealth, the accumulation of influence, the outcome of political struggles, is indifferent from the perspective of the cosmos and of the rational soul that has genuinely aligned itself with the cosmos. What matters genuinely and without qualification is the quality of the ruling faculty's engagement with whatever presents itself, the justice or injustice of a response, the honesty or dishonesty of a judgment, the courage or cowardice of a choice. These things matter because they are the ruling faculty's proper business, and the ruling faculty is the only part of a human being that is genuinely one's own. Everything else is on loan: the body, the role, the empire, the name that will be carved in stone and then slowly or quickly worn by rain and wind until it is gone. These were held by Marcus as a steward holds what is not finally his, doing the work of stewardship faithfully and without clinging, because the faithfulness was his to give, and the outcome was not. Outside the tent, the river was still running. It had been running before the camp existed, and would run after the camp was gone, and the empire it served had become what all empires eventually become: a pattern of causes, still moving through the world, but no longer legible as the thing it once called itself. Marcus had written, in a passage toward the middle of the notebooks, that a human being is a citizen of two cities. One is the particular city, Rome, Antioch, Nicopolis, wherever the accident of birth or circumstance has placed one. The other is the larger city, the one Zeno of Citium had described when he first began teaching under the painted porch in Athens, the city that includes everyone who reasons, everyone who participates in the rational order that the Stoics called the asterisk logos, asterisk and identified with the organizing principle of the cosmos itself. Marcus, as a particular man, was a Roman of the Antonine dynasty, co-emperor, soldier, administrator, but as a rational being, as a asterisk hegemonikon, asterisk engaged in the practice of philosophy, his city was the world, and his fellow citizens were all those who had ever turned toward the same large and patient questions and attempted to live their answers rather than merely state them. Zeno had arrived in Athens with nothing, the wreckage of a previous life behind him, and had found that what remained after everything else was lost was the capacity to reason, which was also the capacity to live well. Epictetus had found his freedom inside a condition that denied him everything except the inward territory of his own will. And Marcus, seated at the summit of the ancient world's administrative structure, in possession of more external power than any person alive, had found in the same tradition the same discovery, that what the tradition offered was not an upgrade to external circumstances, but a different relationship to all circumstances, which left the ruling faculty clear and oriented regardless of what the circumstances happened to be. These three men, spread across 5 centuries, born into conditions as different as conditions can be, had arrived at something that was not quite a doctrine, and not quite a technique, and not quite a consolation, though it contained elements of all three. It was closer to an orientation, a way of standing in relation to the facts of a human life that made the facts livable in a specific and describable manner, not easy, not free of difficulty, but livable, and that could be practiced daily in whatever conditions the day presented. The lamp had burned lower still. The entry for the night was complete, not finished in any absolute sense, because the entries were never finished in that sense, but complete in the way a day is complete, when the work of it has been honestly done, and what remains undone is simply what tomorrow will ask. Marcus would have reviewed it in the manner described, moving through the record of the day's philosophical practice, not as a judge rendering a verdict, but as a craftsman checking the quality of work done in low light, noting where the hand had been steady, noting where it had wandered, not dwelling long in either assessment, but using both as information about what the next day's practice required. This was the difference between the Stoic evening review and the kind of self-examination that tips into punishment. The review served the practice. It was not an ending, but a preparation for a beginning that would come soon enough, whether or not it was desired. What had been cured today? What bad habit had been noticed and set aside, even briefly? In what respect was the ruling faculty in better order tonight than it had been this morning? These questions were not asked in a spirit of either satisfaction or despair. They were asked in the spirit of honest attention, which is the only spirit in which useful self-knowledge is available. Seneca had noted in his counsel on the same practice that the lamp could be acknowledged as a witness, that reviewing the day in the presence of a small steady flame had something in it of the presence of a principle that does not waver, that is not deceived by performance, that sees what was done and what was merely intended. The lamp that had been burning all evening in Marcus's tent served this function in whatever way such functions are served, as the material form of an attention that does not relax into flattery or severity, but simply stays present. And the ruling faculty, having completed its review, having set down what could be set down, having acknowledged honestly what had been held and what had been surrendered, could release into something that was not sleep yet, but was the philosophical precondition of it, the deliberate settling, the conscious choice to stop holding what had never been worth holding, to stop working at what had already been done or couldn't be done at all, to return to the basic orientation, what is mine to carry and what is not, and find in that return the specific quiet that comes from being in right relation to one's own limits. There is a physical quality to this moment, not always, but often enough that it deserves to be named. It resembles the release of a breath held without knowing it had been held, the unclenching of something that had been gripping somewhere in the chest or the neck or the back of the mind throughout a day that required gripping, the very slight physical shift that occurs when the thinking mind, having genuinely been permitted to stop working, actually stops, not because sleep has taken it, but because the philosophical work has been completed, and the permission is genuine, and the ruling faculty, which has been at its post since before dawn, finally accepts the relief. The Stoics had identified this kind of rest as the natural conclusion of a day of genuine philosophical practice, not because they had developed a theory of sleep, but because the psychological state they were cultivating, the alignment of the ruling faculty with what it can actually govern, the release of effortful resistance to what it cannot, is in its nature the state from which rest is available. The mind that is still gripping yesterday's grievance or tomorrow's anxiety, or the ongoing friction of a resentment not yet set down, is a mind that remains, even in stillness, at work. The ruling faculty that has genuinely practiced its evening review, has genuinely released what was never within its jurisdiction, has genuinely completed the accounting that the Stoic tradition asks of a practitioner at the close of each day. That ruling faculty is not running from rest. It has arrived at it. Marcus had written in one of the later books of the notebooks that the cosmos itself could be understood as a single living organism, rational throughout, in which every part participates in the motion of the whole without needing to understand the whole, or to govern it, or to be anywhere other than where it is. A stone in a field participates in the asterisk logos, asterisk in the way that stones participate. A river participates in the way that rivers participate. A human being participates through the ruling faculty, through reason, through the capacity for deliberate action aligned with the rational order of things, and the quality of that participation is the only thing a human being genuinely contributes to or withholds from the whole. It was a large idea, held lightly, in the low lamplight, at the end of a long day. It was also a quiet one. The participation was not optional. The asterisk logos, asterisk moved through everything, including the tent, including the river, including the man seated at the field table with his notebooks and his low lamp, and his particular history of grief and governance and philosophical aspiration and daily failure and daily renewal. The motion of the whole continued, whether or not any particular part of it was paying attention. The stars continued their courses above the Danube. They had no opinion about the empire that lay below them. They followed the path that the rational order of the cosmos had set, and they would follow it long after the empire was gone, and long after whatever came after the empire, with the same patient indifference to everything that was not their own motion. Marcus had looked at those stars from this same stretch of river many times over the years of the campaign. He had practiced the view from above not as a literary gesture, but as a genuine exercise, the deliberate attempt to shift perspective from the immediate and personal to the vast and impersonal, to see the military camp as it would appear from somewhere far above it, a small bright smear of firelight in an immense dark, to see the river winding through the landscape without reference to the politics of the civilizations on either bank, to see the earth as it might appear from the distance of the stars themselves, a small bright point in a field of other small bright points, none of them designated, none of them labeled, all of them moving in the same patient way. From that vantage point, the specific anxieties of the day did not disappear. The Stoics were not proposing a form of amnesia, a practiced forgetting of what demanded response. They were proposing something more precise, the recalibration of proportion, the return of each concern to its accurate size. The bureaucratic difficulty that had occupied most of the afternoon was a real difficulty. It was also, from a sufficient altitude, a small one. The decision that had pressed on him with what felt like objective urgency was genuinely important, from close range. It was also in the river of vanishing moments that constituted all of human history, already resolved by time into the category of what has passed and what continues. Both of these things were true at once. The view from above did not cancel the close range. It restored the close range to its proper relationship with the larger frame, so that what seemed like objective crisis from within the frame could be seen more accurately as one frame among many, real and consequential and limited in the way that all frames are limited, which is to say, not infinitely important, not the measure of all things, not worth the kind of continued internal friction that keeps a ruling faculty working when its work is done. The lamp had nearly exhausted itself. The tent was almost dark. In the dark before sleep, the asterisk hegemikon asterisk settles into what it is when the performance is over and the day has been properly completed. Not a blank state, not an empty one. The quality of settled attention that has no particular object, that holds everything lightly in the way that a hand can hold water lightly if it does not try to grip, cupped open, patient, receiving and releasing in the same unhurried gesture. This was what Marcus had been practicing toward. Every morning, when he reminded himself that the day would bring difficult people and that the response to them was his own to choose, and every evening when he set down the record of how close or how far the actual day had come from the standard the practice was trying to maintain. Not a destination, a direction. held across years and decades, refined in small ways through the accumulation of honest accounting, never finished, never abandoned, kept faithfully in the specific and modest way that a lamp keeps light, by burning what it has as steadily as it can for as long as it is able. The river ran on outside. It did not change its speed for the arrival of night. The water did not know that it was night. It moved as water moves when nothing prevents it, along the path the landscape offers, toward the sea it has never seen, through the dark without hesitation, doing what it does so completely that the question of whether it is doing it well does not arise. There is something in the sound of running water at night that the mind moves toward rather than away from, a regularity that is not mechanical, a continuity that does not assert itself. The river had been here before the camp was built, and it would be here after the camp was gone, and it had no opinion about either of these facts. It simply ran, as the stars simply moved, as the logos simply moved through everything, the rational order of the cosmos conducting its patient and indifferent and somehow deeply regular business in the dark outside the lamp's reach. The asterisk hegemonicon asterisk of Marcus Aurelius would have recognized this in the last moments before the lamp went out, not as a thought to be formed into a sentence, as a recognition that does not require words, the kind that arrives when the words have been used and set down and are no longer needed, and what remains is the thing the words were pointing at, present and quiet, and requiring nothing further from the person in whose company it has arrived. He had written, somewhere in the notebooks, that the morning would come, and with it more people, more difficulty, more occasion for impatience, and the management of impatience, more petition, more judgment, more of the long and ordinary work of keeping the ruling faculty honest in conditions that did not always make honesty easy. He had written this not as a dread, but as a preparation. The weather before stepping outside, the condition one accepts and continues in. But the morning was not yet. The morning was on the other side of the dark, and the dark required nothing, held nothing to which the ruling faculty needed to attend, offered nothing that demanded a response. Seneca had written, in another place, that it is in the nature of the mind to keep working past the point where working serves it, to continue solving problems that have already been solved, to rehearse conversations that have already occurred, to prepare for difficulties that may never arrive. He had prescribed the evening review precisely as a container for this tendency, a definite time, a definite practice, a deliberate completion, so that the mind would have somewhere to set what it was carrying, rather than carrying it through the night. The notebooks had served this function for Marcus.